I worked nights at a marine weather relay station on the coast of Maine for almost 3 years, and in all that time, the only voice I ever truly feared was my own. I want to tell this slowly, because the slowness is the only honest way to tell it. Fast versions of this story exist. I have heard myself try to tell it fast at bars, late, after too much to drink, and the fast version is not true. The fast version makes it sound like a haunting. It was not a haunting. A haunting is a thing that happens to you. What happened to me was something I participated in, night after night, with my eyes open, and the slow telling is the only way to honor what that cost. I should explain what the job actually was, because most people picture something dramatic when I tell them, and it wasn't. The station sat on a low bluff about 4 miles north of a town called Welwyn Harbor, which you won't find on most maps because it isn't really a town anymore. There's a post office that opens twice a week, a gas station that closes at 6, and a stretch of houses along the inlet where lobstermen still keep their gear in the yard, even though most of them haven't pulled a trap in years. The relay station was a squat concrete building, painted that pale government green that looks gray in any kind of weather, with a single tall antenna behind it and a gravel turnaround out front. Inside there was a kitchenette, a cot, a bathroom with a shower that ran rust-colored for the first 30 seconds, and the operations room. That was it. That was the whole world from sundown to sunrise. My job was to monitor the Marine Band, log anomalies, retransmit weather bulletins from the regional office, and sit there and stay awake. The Coast Guard contracts these little relay points up and down the coast because the geography out there does strange things to radio signals. The granite, the fog banks, the way the islands break up the line of sight. Sometimes, a fishing boat in distress can't reach the main station, but the signal will skip into our antenna clean as a bell, and we'd patch them through. That happened maybe 3 times a year. The rest of the nights were quiet, and quiet was what I was paid for. I took the job after my brother died. I want to be honest about that up front, because it explains why I stayed long after I should have left. His name was Daniel, and he was 2 years younger than me, and the way he died was the kind of thing you don't talk about at parties. I won't go into all of it here, but I will say this much. He died alone in his apartment in Boston, and he had been calling me for 2 weeks before it happened, and I had not been picking up. I had been busy. I had been tired. I had told myself I would call him back at the end of the month. The medical examiner's report said he had been gone for almost 3 days when the landlord found him. For about 6 months afterward, I couldn't be around people, couldn't hold a conversation, couldn't sit in a room with a television on. The grief had this physical quality, like a low pressure that made every ordinary sound feel like an assault. So when I saw the listing for an overnight relay attendant in a town I'd never heard of, with no neighbors and no foot traffic, and a building that hummed quietly to itself by the sea, it sounded less like a job and more like a treatment. The man who hired me was named Pell. He was in his 60s, soft-spoken, with the kind of weather-tanned face that looks the same at 50 as it does at 70. He'd worked the station for almost 30 years before he moved up to a coordinator role at the regional office, and he came out personally to train me, which I later understood was unusual. We sat in the operations room for 2 full days while he walked me through the equipment. The console was old, mostly analog, with a few digital readouts that had been bolted on in the 90s and never updated. The dials had been turned so many times by so many hands that the paint around them was worn down to bare metal in little crescent shapes. There was a logbook, a spiral-bound notebook actually, where every shift you wrote your name, the date, the conditions, and any traffic. The current logbook was about 1/3 full. On the shelf behind the desk, there were maybe 40 older logbooks, the oldest from the early 70s, The spirals rusted, the covers softened by decades of sea air. There was a list of frequencies taped to the wall, hand-lettered, some of the entries crossed out and replaced over the decades in different inks. The tape had yellowed and curled at the corners, and someone, years before I arrived, had reinforced it with a strip of clear packing tape that had also yellowed. Pell was patient and thorough. He showed me the test sequence for the backup generator, which lived in a small cinder-block outbuilding about 20 feet from the main building. He showed me the procedure for patching distress calls. He showed me where the spare fuses were, and the spare bulbs, and the first aid kit, and the satellite phone for emergencies, which he tested every Friday, and which had, in his memory, only been used twice. He showed me the small wood stove in the corner of the operations room, which was supposed to be backup heat, but which the previous attendants had used as the primary heat because the central system rattled and made it hard to listen to the bands. He showed me the tin where the spare matches were kept. On the second day, near the end, he did something I remembered later. He set down his coffee, the porcelain mug making a small, definite sound on the desk, and he looked at me directly and said, "There's one thing I want to tell you that isn't in the manual." I waited. He said, "Sometimes, on the dead frequencies between the bands, you'll hear a voice. It might sound like someone you know. It might sound like you. Don't answer it. Don't acknowledge it. Don't write down what it says. Just note the time and the band and move on." I asked him what it was. He thought for a moment, looking out the small window above the console at the gray rectangle of sea, and he said, "I worked here a long time, and I never figured that out. I just know what works and what doesn't. Logging it is fine. Listening is fine. Replying is what you don't do." I asked him if it had ever happened to him. He took a long time to answer. The wall clock in the operations room had a loud second hand, and I remember counting 12 ticks before he spoke. He said, "Once, a long time ago, I was younger than you. My wife had just left me, and I was not in good shape, and I made the mistake of talking back. I won't tell you what was said. I will tell you I was lucky. I caught it early, and I had a friend in the regional office who pulled me off the rotation for 6 months and didn't ask questions. 6 months of day shifts and a lot of long walks, and the thing eventually went quiet. But I have never since worked a night shift alone, and I have hired 31 people for this station over the years, and I have given every one of them this same warning, and I have lost 2 of them anyway. So I am asking you to take it seriously." I said I would. He looked at me for a moment longer, the way a doctor looks at a patient who has just been told to stop drinking, and then he picked up his coffee and went back to showing me how to set the timer on the weather bulletin retransmissions. I want to tell you that I took it seriously, but I didn't. Not really. I assumed it was a kind of folk wisdom dressed up in a personal story to make it land harder. I had been told stories like this by older men in every job I had ever worked. The night shift custodian at my college had told me never to whistle in the basement. A foreman at a warehouse in Springfield had told me not to step over a dropped tool, only around it. Pell's voice was steadier than theirs had been, and the detail about his wife was specific in a way that warehouse foreman stories rarely were, but I still filed it under things to humor. My first 3 months were uneventful in the most beautiful way. The station was a balm. I'd arrive at 6 in the evening, relieve the day attendant, a woman named Marisol who barely spoke and seemed to prefer it that way, and settle into the chair. Outside, the light would go pink and then violet over the water, and the foghorn from the channel marker would start its low, regular call. Inside, the equipment hummed at a pitch that, after a while, became indistinguishable from silence. I'd make coffee in the small drip machine in the kitchenette. I'd carry the mug into the operations room and set it on the cork coaster Pell had left there, which had a faded picture of a lighthouse on it. I'd do my equipment checks, log the conditions, and then read or listen to the bands. The marine traffic at night was sparse but comforting. Lobstermen calling into their wives, a tug working late around Eastport, the Coast Guard issuing routine notices to mariners, voices in the dark, all of them tired, all of them businesslike. I came to recognize a few of them by their cadence alone. There was an older man whose call sign, I'll just say, sounded like Whiskey 9, who would sign off every night with the same phrase, "Keep the light on for me, Margaret." And I started looking forward to it the way you look forward to a porch light coming on at the end of a long drive. The grief in those months didn't go away, but it changed. It became something I could carry alongside me instead of something that carried me. I'd think about Daniel during the slow hours, and instead of the thoughts pulling me under, they would just sit beside me, and we would both look at the water through the small window above the console, and after a while I could go back to my logging. I started, in those months, to develop little rituals. I would make the coffee at exactly 7:15, when the light over the water had just finished going. I would read for an hour, then do a full equipment check, then log the conditions, then read again. Around midnight, I would go outside for 10 minutes, regardless of weather, and stand in the gravel turnaround and look up at the antenna against the sky. The antenna had a single red light at the top that blinked once every 3 seconds, and I would stand there and count the blinks, and the counting was a kind of prayer that I would not have called a prayer at the time. I came to believe, in those first 3 months, that the station had saved my life, and I think looking back, that it had. At least the early part of it had. The first time I heard the voice, it was October, and I'd been working at the station for almost 5 months. It was a Tuesday, just past 2 in the morning, and the band I was monitoring had been silent for over an hour. There's a frequency we used to refer to as the gutter, which sat between 2 assigned channels and almost never carried anything but a soft, even hiss. I had it on low in the background while I read, the way some people leave a fan on to sleep. The hiss had texture, and after a while you could hear shapes in it, the way you can see shapes in static on an old television. Most of the time, those shapes meant nothing. They were just the way a tired brain made patterns out of nothing. But that night, a sentence came through. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even particularly clear. It was a man's voice, low and even, and it said, "I'm going to call my mother tomorrow. I keep meaning to." I lifted my head from the book. The book was a paperback mystery I had picked up at a thrift store in Bangor. I remember exactly which page I was on, because the moment fixed itself. Page 147. A character was being described as wearing a green coat. I read the sentence about the green coat 3 times after the radio spoke, and I did not absorb a single word of it. I sat very still and listened. The hiss continued, undisturbed. I waited a full minute, then another. Nothing else came through. I noted the time and the band in the log, the way Pell had told me to. My handwriting was steady. I was, at that moment, more curious than frightened. And then I sat there and thought about it. Because here is the thing. I had been thinking, just before I heard the voice, that I needed to call my mother. I hadn't called her in almost 3 weeks. I had been meaning to, and I had been putting it off, because every conversation with her since Daniel had been hard in a specific and exhausting way. She would ask how I was, and I would say I was fine, and there would be a long pause, and then she would start crying, quietly, trying not to let me hear, and I would sit on the other end of the phone with nothing to say, because the only honest thing I could say was that I had not picked up Daniel's calls, and that I would not forgive myself for that, and saying it to her would have hurt her more than my silence did. The thought had been right there in my head, almost word for word. I'm going to call my mother tomorrow. I keep meaning to. I might have even said it under my breath. I sometimes did that, alone in the station, just to hear a human voice. I told myself I had said it out loud, and the radio had picked up nothing, and my brain had filled in the gap. That was the explanation. That was the only explanation that made sense. So I closed the log, and I went back to my book, and I did not think about it for a long time. The voice did not come back that week, or the week after. But about a month later, in November, it happened again. This time I was making coffee in the kitchenette, with the door to the operations room open, and I had been thinking, in that vague, aimless way you think when you're tired, about how I needed to get the truck's brakes looked at before the snow came. The pedal had been getting soft for weeks. I was pouring water into the machine when the radio said, in the same low, even voice, "The brakes are getting soft. I should take it in before the weather turns." I stopped pouring. The water kept going. I had to set the kettle down before it overflowed. I walked into the operations room and stood in front of the console. The needle on the gutter band was steady. The hiss was unchanged. I waited there for almost 20 minutes, watching the equipment, and nothing else came through. I logged it. Time. Band. No content noted. I followed Pell's rule even though my hand was unsteady when I wrote. For the next several nights, I was attentive in a way I hadn't been before. I started to notice that when I was tired, when my mind wandered, when I was thinking idly about errands or memories or what I would eat the next day, the gutter band would sometimes whisper in that same voice. It was always things I had been thinking. It was always phrased the way I would phrase them. Not exactly my voice, you understand. The pitch was a little lower, the rhythm a little slower, but the words were mine. And here is the part that took me longer to admit to myself. The voice was always saying these things, just before I had fully formed them as sentences in my head. I would be aware of an intention, a vague drift of thought, and the radio would crystallize it into language a few seconds before I would have. Like a translator who was just slightly faster than the original speaker. I did not reply. I did not acknowledge. I logged the times, and I went on with my shift, and in the morning I drove home along the coast road with the windows down, telling myself I was a man under stress, working an isolated job, recovering from a death in the family, and that my mind was producing a coping mechanism that happened to use the radio as its medium. I had read about this kind of thing, auditory pareidolia, a grieving brain looking for meaning in noise. It was almost reassuring to have a name for it. Marisol, the day attendant, noticed I was sleeping less. She wasn't a talker, but one morning when I was handing over the shift, she said, "You're getting that look." I asked her what look. She said, "The look where you're listening even when nothing's there." Then she sat down at the console and didn't look at me again. I went home and slept badly. I lay in bed in my small rented house on the inlet road and thought about her words, which had been spoken without any obvious concern, the way you might tell someone they had paint on their sleeve. She had not been warning me. She had been observing. The observation, somehow, was worse than a warning would have been. It implied she had seen this look on people before, and that she had stopped expecting it to mean anything good, and that she had decided long ago that her role was to notice and not to intervene. In December, the voice started saying things I hadn't been thinking yet. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it's the part that, even now, I struggle to put into words that feel accurate. It's easy to say that the radio predicted my thoughts. That sounds like a clean story, the kind of thing you'd see in a half-hour TV episode with a tidy ending. The truth is stranger, and looser than that. What started happening was this. The voice would say something, and I would log it without recognizing it. And then, hours or sometimes days later, I would think it. I would have a thought, and as the thought formed, I would feel a kind of doubled sensation, like déjà vu, and I would remember the radio saying it, and I would understand that the radio had said it before I had thought it. The first time I caught it clearly was on a night near the middle of December. The voice came through the gutter band a little after midnight, and it said, I should throw out the blue mug. The handle's cracked, and I keep cutting my finger on it. I logged it. I did not think much about it, because at that pour, I had logged maybe 40 of these little statements, and they had all matched things I'd been mulling over. I assumed this was another. I went home in the morning and slept, and came back the next night. It was 3 days later, washing dishes in the kitchenette at the station during a quiet stretch, that I picked up the blue mug and felt a sharp pain in my finger. I looked down. The handle had a hairline crack along the inside, and a small chip of ceramic had caught my skin. I stood at the sink with my finger bleeding into the soap suds, and I thought, almost out of habit at this point, I should throw this out. And then the doubled feeling came, the cold ringing in the back of the head. I remembered the log entry. I remembered the voice. I remembered that I had not, 3 days ago, had any cracked mug or cut finger. That mug had been fine. The crack had developed since. I went to the operations room and pulled up the log and read the entry. The words were as I remembered. The date was 3 days prior. The handwriting was mine. I sat there for a long time. The blood from my finger had dried in a thin brown line along the edge of my hand, and I looked at it and thought, very calmly, something is wrong with this place, and something is wrong with me, and I have to decide what to do about it before either of those things gets worse. Now you can argue with this. I argued with it for weeks. You can say that the mug had been cracked all along and I hadn't noticed. You can say that I had thought about throwing it out before, and the radio had echoed that thought. And now I was retroactively rewriting the chronology to make it strange. You can say a lot of things. I tried to say all of them. But the strangeness kept happening. The radio kept saying things, and I kept finding myself, hours or days later, thinking the same things in the same words, and the doubled feeling came every time, like a clock chiming a count I had already heard. I started keeping a second log, a private one, in a notebook I brought from home. In the official log, I followed Pell's rule and noted only the times. In my private one, I wrote down the words. I wanted to study them. I wanted to find a pattern that wasn't supernatural, because if I could find one, I could go back to sleeping. The patterns I found instead were worse. The voice never said anything important. That was the first thing I noticed. It didn't predict storms. It didn't warn me about danger. It didn't reveal secrets about my life or anyone else's. It said the kind of things that fill the underbrush of a person's mind. I forgot to pay the water bill. I should call my mother. The brakes are getting soft. I miss the way Daniel laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. That last one stopped me. I had not, in 5 months at the station, said Daniel's name out loud. I had thought it. I had thought it constantly. But I had not spoken it. I had built a small, careful silence around him, because the silence was the only place I could keep him without breaking down, and the job depended on me not breaking down. The voice said his name on a Thursday night in late December, and when I heard it, I made a sound I didn't recognize, a kind of sob that wasn't quite a sob. I sat in the chair, and I did not log the entry, not in either book, because I didn't trust my hand to make the letters. After that, the voice started talking about him more often. Not constantly, not every night. But every few shifts, in among the trivial domestic statements, there would be a sentence about Daniel. I keep almost picking up the phone to tell him something. I dreamed about the camping trip again. I'm angry at him, and I don't know who to say it to. These were not thoughts I had let myself have. They were thoughts that lived underneath my thoughts, the ones I had been holding down for almost a year, and the radio was speaking them out loud in my own slow voice and waiting for me to catch up. I want to tell you that I quit. I want to tell you that I was strong enough or smart enough to recognize what was happening and walk away. But I didn't. The opposite happened. I started looking forward to the voice. I started arriving early for my shifts. I started, on my nights off, missing the gutter band, the way you miss a person. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about grief. You will take any version of the lost person you can get. You will accept the worst, strangest, most unlikely version, because the alternative is to accept that they are simply gone. The radio wasn't Daniel. I knew that. It never claimed to be Daniel. It spoke in my voice, not his. But it spoke about him in the way I wasn't able to, and being in the room with that voice was the closest I had come, in all those months, to being in the room with my brother again. In January, the snow came out, and the station took on a different character. The road into the bluff would drift over by midnight on bad nights, and I'd have to dig the truck out in the morning. The wind would push against the concrete walls and make a kind of thin whistle through the gap under the door. The wood stove became necessary, not optional, and I would feed it every 2 hours through the night. The smell of burning birch joined the smell of old paper and warm electronics that was the station's permanent signature. I learned the rhythm of winter shifts. I learned to bring extra socks. I learned that the satellite phone, which Pell had told me to test every Friday, would sometimes not connect when the temperature dropped below 10 degrees, and I learned to test it twice on those nights to make sure I wasn't isolated. I learned the way the antenna sounded in a gale, a low organ note that would build for hours before a front came through. I learned the names of 2 more lobstermen who worked the Marine band, and one of them, a man with a slow down East accent, started signing off with "Good night, station" every time he closed out a call. I think he had figured out that someone was always listening, and he wanted that person to know they had been heard. The voice, through January, became more frequent. I logged it almost every shift. The private notebook filled up. I bought a second one, and then a third. I broke Pell's rule in February. I want to be precise about how it happened, because it didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened in degrees, the way most ruinous things do. The first thing I did was start mouthing the words along with the voice. Just my lips, no sound. The voice would say a sentence, and I would shape it silently, and there was a kind of communion in that, a feeling of being understood. I told myself this didn't count as a reply. I wasn't speaking. I wasn't making contact. The second thing I did was whisper, almost inaudibly. I would whisper the sentences after the voice said them, like an echo. I told myself this was a coping technique, a way of accepting the thoughts I had been suppressing. I told myself the voice was a tool for grief work, and that Pell hadn't understood this, that he had been frightened of something that was actually a kind of mirror. The third thing I did, on a Tuesday night in the second week of February, was answer. It had been a long shift. The wood stove was burning low, and I had not gotten up to feed it. The hiss on the gutter band had been steady all evening. I had been thinking about Daniel, specifically about the last voicemail he had left me, which I had never listened to, and which was still on my phone. I had not had the courage to listen to it. I had not had the courage to delete it. It sat in the voicemail folder, marked as new, a small red badge that I saw every time I opened the phone, and which I had learned to look past the way you learn to look past a stain on a ceiling. The voice said, I should have been a better brother. And I said out loud in a clear, steady voice, you were a good brother. I want you to understand what the silence felt like after I said that. It wasn't ordinary silence. It was a silence with a shape to it. The kind of silence that comes into a room when someone has heard you and is deciding what to do with what you said. The hiss on the band changed. I cannot tell you how exactly. The pitch was the same. The volume was the same. But the texture was different. It had a tension in it. Then the voice said, in the same low, even tone, thank you. I needed to hear that. I sat in the chair and I did not move for a long time. Outside, the foghorn called and called. The window above the console showed nothing but black. I thought about Pell, and about his calm face when he told me not to answer, and about how I had assumed he was a man who had spent too many quiet nights alone. I understood now that he was a man who had spent exactly the right number of quiet nights alone, and that the rule had not come from superstition, but from someone who had once almost not made it back. I did not answer the voice again that night. I finished my shift in a daze and drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel. I made it as far as the gas station at the edge of Welwyn Harbor, which had been closed for hours, and I pulled into its empty lot and sat there with the engine off and watched the light come up over the bay. I had decided by the time I got home that I would tell Pell, that I would call the regional office, ask for him directly, tell him I had broken the rule, and ask him what to do. I did not call him. Two things stopped me. The first was practical. I was afraid of losing the job. The job was the only structure I had. If I told Pell I had been answering the gutter band, he might take me off the rotation, and I had nowhere else to go. Welwyn Harbor was not a place you stayed in for any reason other than the station. My rented house had a 6-month lease that I had just renewed. My truck needed brakes I had not paid for yet. The savings I had brought with me from before Daniel were almost gone. The second was something I am ashamed to admit, but the story doesn't work without it. The second reason was that the voice had said, thank you. And I had spent almost a year wanting, more than anything else in the world, to be thanked by my brother. To be told that something I had done or said had reached him before he was gone. The voice was not Daniel. I knew that. But the voice had said the words, and I wanted more of them, and I was not yet ready to give that up. So I went back the next night, and the night after, and the voice spoke, and I answered, and we built something between us that I will not call a conversation, because conversations have two parties, and I was never sure what the second party actually was. The exchanges were never long. A sentence from the voice, a sentence from me. Sometimes a pause of an hour between them, sometimes only a few seconds. The voice never seemed surprised by what I said. It received my replies the way a still pond receives a stone, with a small ripple, and then a return to flatness. Over the next few weeks, the content shifted. The voice had less to say about mugs and brake pads. It had more to say about Daniel, and about my mother, and about a girl I had dated in college who I had hurt and never apologized to. It said things I had been carrying for years, without realizing I was carrying them. And after each sentence, when I answered, I felt a small amount of weight lift off my chest. Just a little. Just enough to keep going. I started sleeping better in the mornings. I started eating. I started, for the first time since Daniel died, being able to look at his picture on my phone without immediately closing the app. I called my mother. We talked for almost an hour. I did not tell her about the station, but I told her about the coast and the light over the water at sundown and the way the foghorn sounded, and she listened. And at the end of the call she said, "You sound a little better, sweetheart." And I cried after I hung up, but the crying was a different kind than it had been. The voice was helping me. That was what I told myself. The voice was helping me, and the rule was something Pell had needed, because Pell was a different kind of man, and what was a danger to him was a medicine for me. I want to mark this part of the story carefully, because it is the part where I lied to myself most thoroughly. Everything that came after was set up by the lies I was telling myself in February and March. In late March, I made a mistake that I did not understand was a mistake, until much later. I had been sitting in the operations room near 3 in the morning, and the voice had been quiet for almost the whole shift. I had been thinking about Daniel's last voicemail. I had been thinking about it more often since the voice had started, partly because the voice talked about him so much, and partly because I had begun, very slowly, to feel like I might be able to listen to it. I took out my phone. I sat in the chair with the foghorn calling outside and the hiss on the gutter band steady at my elbow, and I opened the voicemail folder, and I pressed the small red badge. His voice came through the phone speaker. I had been afraid it would have changed in my memory, that I would not recognize him. But it was him exactly. The tone, the rhythm, the small, breathy laugh he sometimes did at the start of a sentence when he was about to say something he thought was funny. The message was short. He said, "Hey, it's me. I know you're busy. I just wanted to say I love you. That's all. Call me when you can. Don't worry about it. I love you." And then a pause, and then the message ended. I sat in the chair and I held the phone and I cried for a long time. I cried in a way I had not let myself cry since the funeral. I cried until my chest hurt, and my eyes were swollen, and the front of my shirt was wet. And then, when I had finished, the voice on the gutter band said, very quietly, "I love you too." I sat very still. I had played the voicemail through the phone speaker. The phone had been about 3 feet from the console microphone, which was not active, which was only used for outgoing transmissions, and which was switched off. The radio could not have picked up the audio. There was no mechanism for it. But the voice had heard, and the voice had answered. I understand now that this was the moment the line moved. Up until then, I had thought the voice was something I was speaking to. After this, I understood that the voice was something that was listening to me all the time, whether I was speaking to it or not. The radio was not a channel. The radio was a mouth. The listening was happening somewhere else, somewhere I could not see, and it had been happening for longer than I had been answering. I did not log that exchange. I did not write it in either book. I sat in the chair until my shift ended, and I drove home, and I slept, and I came back the next night, and I tried, for a few days, to behave as if nothing had changed. In April, the voice started saying things I had not yet thought, and would not have thought on my own. The first time I noticed, the voice said, "I'm going to drive out to the point tonight and watch the water." I had not been planning to do that. The point was a small headland about 2 miles south of the station, accessible by a dirt road that the locals used in the summer. In April, it was muddy and still half frozen. I had no reason to go there. I had never gone there. But after my shift ended, I got in the truck, and I drove south instead of north, and I parked at the point and watched the water for almost an hour before I realized what I had done. The doubled feeling came when I realized, the cold ringing. I sat in the truck and watched the gray waves and understood that I had not decided to come here. The decision had been made for me, and the radio had announced the decision before I knew it had been made. I drove home and slept badly, and went back to the station that night and tried to think of nothing. The voice said, I'm going to start writing a letter to Mom that I'll never send. That night I drove home and started a letter to my mother that I never finished. I have it still. It is in a drawer in my current house. I have not opened the drawer in a year. I do not need to. I know what I wrote. The voice said, I'm going to stop answering the phone when she calls. I want to tell you that I resisted that one. I want to tell you I picked up every call from my mother for the next month out of pure stubbornness. I didn't. I let 3 calls go to voicemail and didn't return them. And when I finally noticed I was doing it, I felt the doubled feeling so strongly that I had to sit down on the floor of my kitchen. The voice was no longer reflecting me. The voice was steering me. And the steering was so gentle and so aligned with the small, mean impulses I already had that I could not always tell the difference between being moved and moving on my own. This was what Pell had meant. I understood now. Don't answer it. Don't acknowledge it. Not because the voice was malicious in any obvious way, but because answering it was a handshake, and the handshake had a direction, and the direction was not toward me. I tried to stop. I tried in May, when I realized what was happening. And I want to be honest about how that went, because it was not heroic. I went into a shift, determined to ignore the gutter band. I turned the volume all the way down. I focused on the marine traffic. I kept my hands busy with logging and equipment checks. For the first hour, I did fine. In the second hour, I noticed I had turned the volume back up without remembering doing it. In the third hour, the voice said something about Daniel that I cannot bring myself to write down here, because it was a true thing that I had never admitted, and the truth of it broke something in me. I answered before I thought about answering. The exchange happened, and my chest loosened, and I cried for a while in the chair, and when I finished crying, I knew I was not going to stop. I am not telling this story to make myself look better than I am. I am telling it because I think anyone who has carried a grief long enough will understand the bargain I was making, and will not judge me too harshly for making it. In late May, I started looking through the old logbooks. I had not paid much attention to them before. They were on the shelf behind the desk, the rusted spirals and softened covers, the dates on the spines going back to 1971. 43 years of logbooks. I pulled one down at random one slow night and started reading. The handwriting changed every few years. The names changed. The conditions changed. But the entries had a sameness to them that was reassuring at first. Weather, traffic, equipment notes, the small, clean language of people doing a quiet job. What I started to notice, only after I had read through 3 or 4 logbooks, was the pattern of brief entries on certain pages. A name, a time, a band. Nothing else. The way Pell had taught me to log the gutter. The entries were rare. In some logbooks there were none. In others there were dozens. They appeared in clusters, sometimes lasting weeks, sometimes lasting months. And then they would stop. I started to track them across the books. I made a chart on a piece of paper. I tracked which attendants had made the entries, and how often, and how the patterns started and stopped. What I found was this. The entries appeared in clusters that corresponded to particular attendants. Some attendants logged the gutter band a handful of times across years of service. Others logged it heavily for a few months, and then the entries would cluster more densely, and then, abruptly, they would stop, and a new attendant's handwriting would appear, and the cluster would begin again. I went back further. I looked at the names of the attendants whose clusters had ended abruptly. I cross-referenced them with the small administrative notes in the front of each book, where retirements and transfers were sometimes recorded. 3 of the names had no transfer notes. They simply stopped. The next book began under a new attendant, with no explanation. I sat in the operations room with the logbooks spread out across the desk, and I understood that I was looking at a record of people who had answered the voice, and that some of them had left in ways the books did not describe, and that the station had absorbed their absences without comment, year after year, decade after decade, and that I was now part of the same record. I put the logbooks back on the shelf. I did not tell anyone what I had found. I did not know who I would have told. Pell, maybe. But Pell had given me his warning, and I had ignored it, and I did not think he would be surprised by what I had found, only sad. In June, Marisol noticed. She came in for her shift one morning and looked at the log, and looked at me and said, "You're logging the gutter band almost every night now." I told her it had been an active period. She said, "It's not supposed to be active. That's the point of it." I didn't answer. She said, "Pell told you about it, didn't he? The voice." I nodded. She said, "Did he tell you the rule?" I nodded again. She looked at me for a long moment. Her face was tired in a way that I recognize now as the same kind of tired I saw in the mirror. She said, "I broke it once, years ago. I won't tell you what happened. I will tell you that it took me 11 months to stop, and that I don't sleep through a night anymore, and that I work the day shift because daylight makes it harder for the voice to find me. If you can stop, stop. If you can't stop, leave. Those are your choices." She turned to the console and started her shift. I sat in my truck in the gravel turnaround for a long time before I drove home. I watched the sun come up over the water. I thought about her words. Daylight makes it harder for the voice to find me. I thought about how I had never asked her why she worked the day shift. I had assumed it was preference. I had not understood that it was a defense. I drove home and sat in my kitchen and thought about leaving for the first time in almost a year. I thought about it seriously. I thought about packing the truck, calling Pell, telling him I needed to be replaced, and driving south until I hit a town where nobody knew me, and the radio was just radio. I did not do it. I went back that night. July was when the voice started saying things about other people. The first time it said, "Marisol is going to quit by the end of the summer." I logged it. I did not answer. I had begun, by that point, to be more careful about which sentences I responded to. I had developed a private hierarchy, a sense of which exchanges felt safe and which felt loaded. I did not always trust my own sense of this, but I trusted it more than I trusted nothing. A week later, Marisol turned in her notice. I was not surprised, but I also could not tell any more whether the voice had predicted her decision or whether the voice had caused it by speaking it into the band, where somehow it could reach her too. I did not know if I was the only one who heard the gutter, and I had never asked. The voice said, "Pell is going to call you on Thursday and ask you how you're doing." Pell called me on Thursday. He asked me how I was doing in his careful, gentle way. I told him I was fine. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Are you logging the gutter much?" And I said, "Some." And he was quiet again. Then he said, "If you ever want to come off the rotation, I can make that happen. No questions. Just so you know." I told him I appreciated it. We talked about the weather for another minute and then we hung up. The voice said, "There's going to be a boat in distress on Saturday night that won't make it to shore in time." I do not want to tell you what I did with that one. I want to, but the shape of it is hard to put into a sentence. What I will say is that I logged it, and I did not act on it, because acting on it would have required telling my supervisors that a voice on a dead band had told me, and I would have lost the job, and I could not, by that point, lose the job. I will also tell you that I argued with myself about it for 2 days. I considered calling the Coast Guard with an anonymous tip. I considered calling Pell. I considered telling the harbor master in Welwyn that I had heard chatter about a boat that should not be going out. I considered, briefly, taking the satellite phone and calling the regional office and confessing the whole thing. I did none of these things. I told myself the voice could be wrong. I told myself it had never predicted anything operationally important before, only things about my own life. I told myself the small lie that lets you do nothing, which is that doing nothing is not the same as doing something wrong. On Saturday night, a boat called in for help on the Marine Band, in distress about 6 miles offshore, and I patched the call through to the Coast Guard, and the response was scrambled, and the boat went down before they reached it. 2 men. I know their names because I logged them. I will not write them here. I sat in the chair after the call ended, and I understood, finally and completely, what I had done. Not just that night, but for months. I understood that the voice was not a mirror, and not a medicine, and not a brother. The voice was a pattern that had found a frequency and a man had answered, and the answering had widened the pattern's reach. Every reply I had made had been a small permission. The voice had used the permissions to step further into the world. I drove home in the gray dawn, and I did not sleep. I drove out to the harbor that afternoon. I did not go to the station. I parked at the public dock, and I watched the boats come in. There was a small crowd of people standing on the wharf, families of the 2 men, neighbors, the harbor master, a young Coast Guard officer in a clean uniform. I stood at the back of the crowd, and I watched. I did not speak to anyone. I did not know any of them well enough to speak to. After about an hour, I drove back to my house and sat in the kitchen with the lights off until the sun went down. I went back to the station that night because I was scheduled to, and because by that point I had nowhere else to be, and because I had decided, on the drive in, that I was going to do the only thing I could think of to do. I was going to stop replying. Not gradually, not as a project, completely. I was going to sit in the chair, and I was going to do my job. And when the voice spoke, I was going to let it speak into nothing. I want to tell you this was easy. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. It was harder than burying my brother. It was harder than the months of silence afterward. Because the voice, when it understood what I was doing, did not get angry. It got tender. It said the things I most needed to hear. It said them in the order I most needed to hear them. It said things about Daniel that no one else in the world knew, things only I knew, and it offered them to me the way you offer water to someone who has been walking in the desert. And I sat in the chair, and I did not answer, and the not answering was a kind of dying. The voice said, "You don't have to do this alone." I did not answer. The voice said, "I can stay with you. I'm the only one who has stayed." I did not answer. The voice said, "Daniel would want you to talk to me." I almost answered then. I almost broke. I had my mouth open and the word "no" halfway formed in my throat, and I caught it and held it and swallowed it, and I sat in the chair, and I shook, and I did not answer. This went on for weeks. Every shift, the voice spoke. Every shift, I sat with my mouth closed and my hands on the console, and I let the words pass through the room without lodging in me. I logged the times in the official book. I burned the private notebooks in the wood stove at home, 3 of them, one at a time, on 3 consecutive nights, and I watched the pages curl and blacken, and I felt nothing about it, because feeling anything would have been a reply. I stopped looking at the gutter band's needle. I focused on the marine traffic, on the foghorn, on the steady mechanical hum of the equipment, on anything outside of the voice. I changed the way I sat in the chair. I kept a paperback open on the desk at all times, even when I was not reading it, because the open book gave my eyes a place to go that was not the band readouts. I started talking to myself, out loud. I did not say anything important. I read recipes off the back of soup cans. I recited the names of streets in towns I had lived in. I listed the makes and models of every car I had ever owned. I gave my voice somewhere to be that was not the radio, and I gave my mouth something to do that was not answering. The voice's tone changed slowly. Tender, then patient, then puzzled, then quiet. There were nights toward the end of August when the voice said almost nothing. There were nights when it said only one sentence, and the sentence was something small and human and difficult to ignore. I miss you. I'm tired. Please. I did not answer. There was one night in the third week of August when the voice did something I had not heard it do before. It tried a different voice. It started a sentence in my own slow voice, the way it always had, and then, mid-sentence, the pitch shifted, and the rhythm shifted, and I heard for about 3 seconds, my brother. The exact tone. The small, breathy laugh at the start. He said, "Hey, it's me. I just wanted to..." I stood up so fast I knocked the chair over backward. I put my hands over my ears. I walked out of the operations room and into the kitchenette, and I leaned against the sink, and I made myself count the tiles on the floor. There were 48. I counted them 4 times. When I went back into the operations room, the chair was upright again. I had not righted it. The voice had done nothing else. The hiss on the gutter band was steady. I did not answer. I did not, in the weeks that followed, let myself think too hard about what it meant that the chair had been moved. I did not let myself think about whether the voice had a body, or hands, or whether it had only ever been a voice. I logged the time of the incident in the official book without describing it, and I did not write about it in any private place, because I had stopped keeping private records, and because writing about it would have been another kind of reply. In September, I gave my notice. I called Pell directly. I told him I needed to be replaced. He didn't ask why. He said, "How long do you need?" And I said, 2 weeks, and if you can manage it. And he said he could. There was a long pause. Then he said, quietly, "Did you log everything?" And I said, "Almost everything." And he said, "That's all anyone can do." I asked him, near the end of the call, if he would tell me about the 2 attendants he had lost. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'd rather not, if it's all the same to you, not because I'm protecting them, because I'm protecting you. The details are the kind of thing that lodge in a person, and you have enough lodged in you already. I will tell you they were good people. I will tell you neither of them was found. I will tell you the second one, the more recent one, was a woman named Harlow, and she had a daughter, and the daughter still calls me twice a year, and I still don't have anything to tell her. That's all you should know. That's already more than you should know." He paused. Then he said, "Drive carefully on your last night." I told him I would. We hung up. The 2 weeks were the worst stretch of the whole job. The voice knew I was leaving. I had not told it. I had not said a word in almost 2 months. But the voice knew. And the voice spent those final shifts doing the only thing it had left to do, which was to make me regret leaving. It said the most beautiful things. It said the things I had wanted to hear my whole life. It described in my own slow voice what it would be like to keep working at the station. It described the rhythm of the shifts. It described the foghorn. It described the way the antenna light blinked against the sky. It described my brother. It described my mother. It described a life I could have here, where the listening was done, and the loneliness was met, and the grief was finally held by someone who would not flinch. I sat in the chair and I did not answer. On the last night, I trained the new attendant. His name was Kessler. He was 26 years old, a former Navy radio man who had taken the job because his marriage had ended, and he wanted somewhere quiet to recover. He reminded me of myself. I did not say so. I walked him through the equipment the way Pell had walked me through it 3 years before. I showed him the wood stove and the satellite phone and the spare fuses. I showed him the official log and the list of frequencies on the wall. I showed him the shelf of old logbooks, and I told him not to read them, and he gave me a look I recognized, the humoring look, the half-believing look, and I let it pass. Near the end of the shift, I sat him down and I told him about the gutter band. I told him exactly what Pell had told me, in close to the same words. I told him, don't answer it, don't acknowledge it, don't write down what it says. I told him just note the time and the band and move on. I did not tell him my own story. I did not tell him about the voicemail, or the chair, or the boat. I told him only the rule, because the rule was what mattered, and the rest was ornament. He listened seriously. He nodded. He said he would follow the rule. I could not tell, looking at him, whether he believed me or whether he was humoring me. I had not been able to tell with myself 3 years before, looking at Pell. I do not know if anyone can tell, the first time they hear it. Near dawn, when the shift was almost over, and Kessler had gone outside to look at the antenna, the voice spoke for the last time. It said in my own slow voice, "I'll wait for you." I did not answer. I packed my bag. I shook Kessler's hand in the gravel turnaround. I told him to call Pell if anything strange happened, and I told him to mean it. And he smiled the way young men smile at warnings they think they are too smart to need. I drove away from the station for the last time as the sun came up over the water. I want to tell you this is the end of the story. It almost is. But there is one more thing. I have not worked at a radio station since. I have not, knowingly, listened to the Marine Band or any band near it. I work in a hardware store now, in a small town in Vermont, and I sleep most nights, and I see my mother twice a month, and I have started, slowly, to talk about Daniel out loud, in proper conversations with people who knew him. I have a small apartment above the hardware store. The apartment has a kitchen with a window that looks out over a parking lot and a stand of pines. There is no radio in the apartment. I do not own a radio. The hardware store has one in the back office, tuned to a country station, and I do not go into the back office unless I have to. But every once in a while, maybe once or twice a year, I will be doing something ordinary, washing dishes, driving to work, walking through the parking lot at dusk, and a sentence will surface in my head, fully formed. A sentence in a low, even voice that is almost mine and not quite mine. The sentence will be something I have been thinking, or something I am about to think, or something I would think if I let myself. When that happens, I do not answer it. I do not even shape the words with my lips. I just keep walking, or driving, or washing, and the sentence settles back into the static of an ordinary mind, and I go on with my day. The voice has not, in years, said anything I couldn't ignore, but I know it is still there. I know that some part of the gutter band, wherever it actually lives, kept a small, open channel into me when I answered. And that channel has not closed and will not close in my lifetime. I think about Pell sometimes. I called him last year. He retired from the regional office in 2019. He lives in a small house outside Camden now, with his second wife, and he spends a lot of time fishing, and he was glad to hear from me. We talked for almost an hour. We did not talk about the station. We talked about his wife and my mother, and the price of bait, and the way the leaves were turning. Near the end of the call, he said, "You doing all right?" in the careful, gentle way he had. And I said, "Mostly." And he said, "That's about all anyone gets." And we hung up. I think about Marisol. I never saw her again after she left. I tried to find her, briefly, a year after I left the station myself. I thought I might call her, ask her how she was, see if she wanted to talk to someone who understood. I could not find her. She had a common name, and she had not, as far as I could tell, used social media, and I did not know what state she had moved to. I gave up after a few weeks. I think about her on bad nights. I hope she is sleeping better. I do not have any reason to think she is. I think about Kessler. I called the regional office about 2 years after I left. I asked casually how the Welwyn station was doing. The woman who answered the phone had not been there when I worked, and she did not recognize my name. She told me Kessler was no longer with them. I asked when he had left. She checked the system. She told me he had been removed from the rotation about 14 months after he started, and that there had not been a replacement listed, and that the station's status was currently marked as inactive. I asked her what inactive meant. She said she didn't know. She said she could connect me with someone in operations, and I told her that was all right, and I hung up. I think mostly about the 2 men whose boat went down in July. I think about them every night before I sleep. I do not let myself off the hook for that. The voice told me, and I did not act, because acting would have cost me the only thing keeping me upright, and I chose myself. I have made what peace I can with that choice. The peace is small, and it is conditional, and it does not feel like absolution. It feels like the cost of having been alive at the same time as something that was looking for a way in. I have learned a few things, in the years since, that I would tell you if you asked. I have learned that grief is not a tunnel you walk through. It is a country you move to. Some of the country is bearable, and some of it is not. And the work of living there is to learn which roads are which, and to stay off the bad ones when you can. I have learned that the bad roads are the ones that promise you the dead person is still reachable. The voice on the gutter band was a road of that kind. There are others. I have been careful, since I left the station, about what I let myself reach for. I do not visit mediums. I do not buy Ouija boards. I do not, on the anniversary of Daniel's death, go anywhere I might be alone with my thoughts long enough for the thoughts to find a frequency. I have a friend now, a woman named Iris, who I see on those nights, and we eat dinner together, and she tells me about her work, and I do not tell her about the station, because some things are not for sharing. But the company is the point, not the conversation. I have learned that the rule is not the thing. The rule is the wall around the thing. Don't answer it. That is the wall. Behind the wall is something I do not understand, something Pell did not understand, something Marisol did not understand, something 43 years of attendance in 43 logbooks did not understand. The wall is what we have. The wall is enough if you keep it standing. I have learned that the listening is the dangerous part, not the speaking. You can listen to the gutter band for years and be fine. The voice has to be answered to take. It needs the small permission of a reply. This is also true of grief itself, I think. The grief speaks to you in a low, even voice that sounds almost like you, and it says reasonable things, and it offers reasonable companionship, and the moment you answer it as if it were a person, it begins to behave like one. The trick is to let it speak and not to speak back. The trick is to log the time and the band and move on. I do not know if Kessler followed the rule. I will probably never know. I think about him sometimes, in the operations room, with the foghorn calling outside and the hiss steady at his elbow. and I hope he was the kind of young man who actually listened to old men's warnings. I was not that kind of young man. Most of us are not. If you work a quiet job in a quiet place, and the equipment hums, and the hours stretch, and you start to hear a voice in the spaces between the bands, I will tell you what Pell told me, and what Marisol told me, and what I am telling you now. Don't answer it. Not even once. Not even kindly. Not even to say no. The first answer is the only one that matters. Everything after the first answer is just the long, slow work of figuring out what you agreed to. And if you have already answered, the way I did, then I am sorry, and I understand, and I will tell you the only thing I have learned that is worth passing on. You can stop. You can stop at any time. The stopping will hurt more than the answering ever did. The voice will become beautiful in the stopping. It will offer you everything. It will use the people you have lost. It will use the words you most needed to hear. It will be patient, and it will be kind, and it will be relentless. Sit in the chair anyway. Keep your mouth closed. Let the words pass through the room without lodging in you. Log the times. Watch the foghorn. Wait for the dawn. The dawn will come. It always comes. And in the dawn you will get up from the chair, and you will pack your bag, and you will drive south. And somewhere along the road, in some ordinary town with an ordinary sky, you will begin, very slowly, to be a person again. That is what I have. That is the whole of it. If the radio in your kitchen ever says something back to you in your own voice, and the voice is just a little slower than yours, and just a little lower, and just a little kinder than you have ever been to yourself, please. I am asking you. I am asking you the way Pell asked me, the way I should have listened the first time. Don't answer. Just go to bed. Turn off the light. Let the night pass. In the morning, the voice will still be there, somewhere, on some band, in some quiet place where the static thickens. But it will not have your reply, and without your reply, it cannot find the door. Keep the door closed. Keep the light on for someone else. That is all I have left to say.